In our last session, I spoke to my friends who claim to be atheists. This may be a shock to you, but there is no such thing as an atheist. No man on earth can live atheism. Atheism means there's no right and no wrong. Who is there that believes that? Atheism believes there's nothing of importance. Does the atheism stay in bed all day? The atheist, if he were really an atheist, would believe there's no meaning in everything. Does he have children? He believes there's no purpose in anything. He's driving down a road and a little child is crossing it. Will he drive over the child as though it's a brown paper bag? Ah, my friends, no man on earth can live atheism. It's far better to choose a life that knows that the universe is governed by a being of infinite love. The Bible tries to tell us of the importance of love. The best chapter's 1 Corinthians 13. I recommend you read it. But let me give you an unknown verse from the Old Testament, from a song of love, sometimes called Canticles or Song of Solomon. Listen. Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm, for love is as strong as death. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it. If a man offered for love all the wealth of his house, it would be utterly scorned. Well, that Old Testament writer had it correct. But the only certain evidence that God is and that he is love is found in the life and acts of Jesus Christ. Let me remind you of a statement of his, as you may not have thought about. Matthew 24:35. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words will never pass away. He was never so lonely. In 3 days he was to be crucified. At the end of 3 days he would be as dead as a stone. How improbable. His words have passed into legal maxims. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, shalt not commit adultery. His words have become proverbs. His words have become consolations. So the words of Christ have passed into doctrines, into laws. They've passed into proverbs. They've passed into consolation, but they've never passed away. How improbable that this should be proved true. But 20 centuries have proved it true. No other teacher of religion ever forecast the eternity of his teachings. Only Jesus. I want you to think on that verse. Hundreds of thousands of the wisest of men and women have acknowledged the deity of Christ. A great scholar by the name of Peake, P-E-A-K-E, said no other teacher ever so completely eliminated the trivial, the temporal, the false. Only Jesus selected the eternal and the universal and placed them in the congenial home of his life and teachings. That's scholar A.S. Peake. And if you're interested in some of my quotations, they're all to be found in this book, which is probably available through Amazon. Martin Rees is not a Christian, but he's the Astronomer Royal of England. And not long ago he wrote a book called The Final Century. What on earth did he mean? He said we have entered an era where a single person can cause the death of millions, can cause a city to be uninhabited for centuries to come. He said one error in cyberspace, not necessarily wicked, maybe from ignorance, can devastate a large segment of society. Our information sources, our industries, our protective sources, our schools, our colleges. One error in cyberspace. Then he goes on to say, that's why I believe there's only a 50-50 chance that our civilization will endure this century. I think this is our final century. Well, he's almost echoing Jesus Christ, who over and over taught that this earth is temporary and there's coming a last day, a day of judgment. Read about that in Matthew 25. Something you've never noticed. In all the books written by the great minds of the world over millennia, including Plato and Aristotle, Julius Caesar, and all the rest, there are errors in all of them. But no one has ever found an error in the teachings of Christ. How can that be? There's only one answer to it. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. In Luke 20, he had this to say, the stone the builders rejected has become the capstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, but he on whom it falls will be crushed. What was he saying? He was saying that God was going to make him the capstone, the top stone of the spiritual temple of truth that God would erect in the world, fostered chiefly by Christianity and by the Bible. What a claim to make, a Galilean peasant, a carpenter. I'm going to be the chief in the world to come. And as Lecky, the historian, says, just the record of this man's life and teachings for 3 years has done more to regenerate and soften the world than all the disquisitions of other writers. If you read the dialogues of Plato, you'll be astonished by the many obvious errors. Some things, he says, are absurd to reason, and some things are quite immoral. But that's not true of Christ. He not only foretold his own influence in the world, he foretold the future of his nation. Let me read it to you. I'm reading from Luke chapter 19. And Christ foretold here something that would take a generation to be fulfilled. 40 years after. 40 in the Bible is always a symbol of testing. Here it is. As he approached Jerusalem, this is Luke 19:41, and saw the city, he wept over it. Remember the type of Jesus, Joseph, of whom no sin is recorded, who saved the world with the bread of life. It's recorded of Joseph, he wept, not 4 times or 5 or 6, but 7 times. I know only of a couple of times where the New Testament says Jesus wept at the grave of Lazarus. Secondly, when he anticipates that Jerusalem and its environs will become a huge grave for cemeteries, tombs, chapels, relics of death, where no man ventured for many, many years. So I read on. He wept over it and said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it's hidden from your eyes. The day will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They'll not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. And in the 21st chapter, he says, after that, Jerusalem will only be inhabited by people that don't know him. And remember, 9/10 of modern Jewry in Jerusalem today is atheistic. Ever since the destruction of the city in AD 70 by the Roman commander Titus, Jerusalem's been controlled by non-Christians except for 1 century after a crusade. The rest of the time being the hand of Islam, the Turks, the Ottomans. Christ foretold it. He said, from the time this city is destroyed till the time of the end, it will not be occupied again by believers. And yet it had been occupied by believers for centuries, even thousands of years. On one occasion, when a prostitute washed his feet and dried them with the hairs of her head, he said, wherever this gospel is taught in all the world, this will be taught. And it is. I'm fulfilling that prophecy today. In Acts 1 and verse 7, the resurrected Christ said to his disciples, a handful. And yet he declared them the salt of the earth. And there's not a lot of salt when you consider the domain of the earth. And so when he spoke to a handful of followers, he said, you'll receive power and you'll be witnesses unto me, not lawyers, witnesses unto me in Judea, Samaria, and unto the uttermost parts of the earth. History suggests that Thomas even got to India. If you read Matthew 24 and Luke 21, you read Christ's description of our own day, when men's hearts fail them for fear, for looking after those things coming on the earth. For even the powers of the heavens will be shaken, as they were in 1945, and since, with atomic weapons. Jesus was what he claimed, and that's our only hope. Can I repeat to you something I've used before, but it's worth repeating. It comes from Charles Spurgeon. Here it is. And you'll find this in this book. Spurgeon says, I'll give the Old Testament to any wise man now living and challenge him to use his imagination to construct an ideal character who will exactly fulfill all that which is foreshadowed in the Old Testament. Remember, he must be a prophet like Moses, and yet a champion like Joshua. He must be both an Aaron and a Melchizedek. He must be both David and Solomon, Noah and Jonah, Judah and Joseph. He must not only be the lamb that was slain, but the scapegoat that was not slain. He must be the temple dove and the priest that slew the bird. But he must also be the altar, the tabernacle, the showbread, and the mercy seat. To puzzle this wise man further, we remind him of prophecies so apparently contradictory we cannot imagine how they could be reconciled in one man. For example, all men shall fall down before him, and yet he's despised and rejected of men. He must begin by showing a man born of a virgin mother. He must be a man without spot or blemish, but upon him the iniquities of the whole world is placed. He must be a glorious one, a son of David, yet a root out of a dry ground. Now, if the greatest intellects could set themselves to invent another key, the types and prophecies of the Old Testament, they couldn't do it. These wondrous hieroglyphics must be left unexplained till one comes forward and proclaims the cross of Christ and the Son of God incarnate. Then the whole is clear, so that he who runs may read and a child may understand. May I remind you of some of the characters of the Old Testament that, according to the New Testament, prefigured the person and life of Christ. First Adam, see Romans 5. The father of us all, made in the image of God, is called the Son of God in Luke 3. That is a type of Christ. Abel, the good shepherd, who died young because of the iniquity of his brother, as Christ was put to death by his brethren. Noah, who saved the whole world, accepted the refuge God appointed, made a covenant with God, and lived for centuries. Abraham is called the father of all nations. He's called the heir of the world. He's called the friend of God. He typifies Christ, who in Isaiah 9 is called the everlasting Father. And he is the heir of the world. Isaac, the typical son, who bared his bosom to the sacrificial knife, who obeyed his father, who was 3 days under sentence of death, but who rose from the altar as in resurrection life. And after that we read that a servant was dispatched to find him a wife. And after Christ rose from the dead, the Holy Spirit put together his wife, the church. Isaac, Jacob, a life of service. If you read Mark's Gospel, pictures Christ as a servant. He wrote for the Romans. Romans weren't interested in ideas, not only interested in actions. Well, Jacob's life's a life of activity, and he prefigured Christ. And when he wrestled with God, that typified Gethsemane. Joseph, no sin in his life. Saviour of the world with the bread of life. Hated by his brethren, sold for pieces of silver to a foreign nation. For years in prison, foretold the future, and wept over his brothers, and gave them a new robe. The Saviour of the world. He's a type of Christ. Moses, there are at least 70 things in the life of Moses that parallel the life of Jesus. He was a great deliverer, and he was great in word and deed. You'll never find that said about other prophets. They're either great in deed or they're great in word. But Moses is great in word and deed because he typified Jesus. Christ's deeds matched his acts. That's why he has no other parallel except Moses. Joshua, do you know that's the Hebrew meaning of Jesus. The next book after the books of Moses is the book of Joshua. He typifies Christ. He took God's people into the promised land, in the land of milk and honey, that typified heaven. He overcame all the obstacles. He didn't fail or be discouraged. He believed God was always with him. You remember Christ said, "The Father hasn't left me alone. He that sent me is with me." And then there's David, another good shepherd, but rejected by his people. Went down via the brook Kedron, that filthy stream that carried the garbage of Jerusalem and the refuse from the temple. And Christ went that way. And Kedron was a symbol of the iniquities of the world that he was to bear. Solomon, the name means peaceful. He had a great empire. He was very wise. Remember, many of these characters, only in what they are good at are they types of Christ. Some of them commit great sins, like Aaron, but he's still a type of Christ as high priest. And Solomon was a type of Christ. So rich, so wise, so peaceful. He typified Christ. Jonah, who for 3 days is out of sight. He'd left the wood of the boat as Christ left the wood of the cross. And for 3 days Jonah's missing, as Christ is missing for 3 days. And they could never find the body of the crucified Christ, for he was risen. I could go on. There's Boaz. There are the cities of refuge. They're all pictures of Jesus in the Old Testament. My friends, listen to me carefully. If you want to have the abundant life, Christ said, I've come that you might have life, that you might have it more abundantly. If you want that to be true for you, you must study, not just read. You must study the words of Christ. And they are self-authenticating to the honest heart. And the witness of the Spirit always accompanies them. Dear friend, I'm offering you heaven on earth. Will you not accept it today? God bless you.